On my grandmother's deathbed, she asked me, do you know who your real mother is? What major plot twist moment have you had in your life? My grandfather was dying of cancer. He was a big, tough man and gradually just wasted away. Sometime near the end, he asked my grandmother to bring him a piece of paper and a pen. He wrote down all the names of his 27 grandchildren. Next to my name was a check. Nobody else had anything next to their names. My grandmother showed it to me after he died. She had no idea what it meant. I still think about that every once in a while. You're the chosen one. The last thing my grandma said to me was, see you tomorrow, and as I walked out her hospital room she said, not I heard her laughing from down the hall at herself. She died 4 hours later. Your grandma had the last laugh. When I was 15, my siblings and I were put into foster care. We had no idea why until the social worker told us that parents were using drugs. Our after school jobs were helping them pay for drugs. They said our money was being saved. My dad wasn't my real dad and 3 out of 5 of my siblings were half siblings. My real dad kidnapped my brother and I when we were babies. We were returned to my mom when he confessed to murdering a woman and then went to jail. He had since been released and we visited him to discover that he had started another family. It was quite the mindfuck. My grandpa was having trouble hearing and it took us a while to convince him to get a hearing aid. In the meantime he got a phone call saying his uncle John had died. He asked about a funeral and was told there wasn't one. That was 2, maybe 3 years ago. I really only saw John when he came up for Christmas, but he was quite the character and my whole family has missed him. A couple weeks ago, my grandpa's cousin came to visit. Grandpa was talking about how he missed John since he died. His cousin said, what are you talking about? I just saw him 2 weeks ago. Turns out my grandpa misheard the phone call. We figure someone else died but we still don't know who. John's probably been wondering why no one invites him for Christmas anymore, or visits, or calls. TLDR, my relatives come back from the dead. This is the funniest one in the whole thread. My twin sister and I were born through in vitro fertilization. Our mom wanted nothing more than to have kids, and her circumstances led her to use a sperm donor. When we were 3 years old, our mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. When we were 6, she passed away. My sister and I were taken in by our aunt, our mom's younger sister. She already had 2 sons and a husband. It was a crazy and emotional time for all of us. But we have become an amazing family unit, and I consider my mom, dad, and brothers as much my immediate family as my sister. You might think this was the major plot twist in my life, but it gets crazier. About 4 years ago, I learned that not only did my original mother have sperm donated to her, but she also had eggs donated to her as well, by her little sister. I lost my biological mom only to be rescued by my genetic mom. All those years I had laughed at the people who said I looked like my brothers and my mom, but the joke was on me. When I think about the sacrifices my 2 moms have made for me and my sister, it blows my mind. Sounds like you have a pretty amazing family all around. I was looking for my social security card in my parents' desk and I found their marriage certificate. It was dated 1 year later than I thought, 6 months before I was born. All of a sudden, the years of thinking my mother resented being stuck home with kids, the terrible resentful marriage they had, it all made sense. It took me until I was 16 to realize there was a reason my parents celebrated their anniversary 4 months before my birthday every year. I was a surprise baby. I actually found out shortly after my grandmother died that she and her husband adopted my mom. From where or why, we have no idea. Mom and I know that we have the same type of ethnic heritage as the people she thought were her parents, which probably indicates she was adopted from somewhere within the family or close friends. Perhaps more interesting is the fact that on her deathbed, I was 100% convinced that my grandma was saying I love you and gathered the whole family to hear, only to realize that she was desperately thirsty and saying I want juice. I hope you guys got her some goddamn juice. Back when I was in college I got a girl pregnant. When my mother found out she broke down crying and divulged that I have a brother out there that I had never met. She had given the boy up for adoption long before I came around. I still wonder to this day if I will run into him. Not me, but I have a friend who found out that his sister that is 14 years older than him is actually his mother. He hates his sister. I kind of wonder if that's what's going on in my family. I have a cousin who is much older than the rest of us and has never really fit in with his family much. When I was a kid, my parents took me to Universal Studios in LA. When we were there, we met Mr. T, and I spent the next 20 years telling my friends that I had met Mr. T. Everything came crashing down when I had dinner one night with my parents and a girlfriend. The topic of meeting famous people came up, and I told my Mr. T story. My parents chuckled and corrected me. "You mean you met the character impersonator playing Mr. T? Childhood ruined. I pity you, fool." When I was 12 or 13, my parents took me out to eat at a restaurant. My dad gave me some change to go play a couple arcade games there, and when I ran out of money, I sat back down. My parents had completely serious looks on their faces, and my dad asked me, "How would you react if we told you that you were adopted?" I freaked out a bit, and then they moved on to a different topic. I wondered about it for years until I realized that I act just like my dad and I look like both my mom and my dad. Haha, trolled it for the win. When I was 7, I found my birth certificate in the basement of my childhood home. The name under father was not the man I'd believed to be my dad my entire life. I didn't tell anyone about it for years. Don a cloak and wear many furs. The wall is quite cold this time of year. Not exactly major, but when my sister needed a passport, she had to have the signatures of both legal parents. That's when we found out that her only legal parent is our mom. Dad just never got around to signing the papers. Worked out well, since only needing one signature made it a lot faster. Finding out at my grandmother's funeral that she worked for MI6, or finding out from my mother when I was 13 that the reason I hadn't seen my father since I was 4 was because he sexually abused me as an infant. My great-great-aunt had a 12 cannon salute at her funeral, and the reason why will remain classified until around 2060. I can't even imagine dealing with a piece of news like the second. I hope you're okay. The largest one for me was finding out my parents were never married, although together for 15 plus years, because my father was still married to his first wife, who miraculously got pregnant and had a child while he was in jail for a year for aiding and abetting a known felon. He's a converted Kentucky hillbilly that used to run moonshine back in the day. He refused to turn in his cousin. Multiple things occurred to me that day. My dad is a felon. I'm a bastard. I have a not quite half sister somewhere. My mother basically had long affair with my father. I hope like heck there is no inbreeding somewhere, because this story is the epitome of the stereotypes I had heard. If you own a truck with a gun rack on it, I'm afraid you are too far gone. I thought I was going to inherit my mother's boobs my whole life. I waited and waited. Then I found out that she got a boob job when I was little. She could technically still pass them down. So recently I helped clean out my parents' basement. Since they really needed it, that place was a shithole. I find a box with a bunch of pictures in it and begin to reminisce about how awesome my childhood was. Me on the NES, me at Disney World, my brother and I at a football game, but then I get to the last picture on the bottom. It is my dad, my mom, and some random chick that looked to be in her early 20s. The picture, judging by the hair, was taken mid to late 80s early 90s. "Hey dad," I called. Mom was out of the house. "What?" he yelled back from upstairs. "Who is this in the picture?" I went upstairs to show him. He stared at it for a moment, blinked, and said, "That is your half-sister, Andrea." What? I pursued more. Half-sister? What? I then proceeded to find out that he had been married before when he was 18 to some stripper from Vegas. He lived in Arizona until he was about 30. Lorelai, or by her stripper name, Karma Yewatfa, had been married to him for about a year until he realized she was a shopaholic, shoplifting, coke dealing, taking abusive B to her daughter. He got the frick out and gave the child to his parents to raise because he was 19 years old. I now have a half-sister who I plan to meet. Well, crap. I love how offhandedly your dad dealt with that. Yeah, that's your half-sister that I never told you about. I posted this previously, but here goes. I found out my stepfather was my biological father whilst who I thought was my dad was still actively in my life. Okay, it's complex, so I'll break it down. I was born to my mother and her husband, let's call him Roger. So mother and Roger were my parents. I grew up thinking Roger was my dad. I knew of nothing else other than these two as my birth parents. When I was 4, my mother and Roger got divorced. My older siblings were always allowed to go visiting Roger, and I rarely got to. I grew up desperately wanting to see my dad Roger. When I was 7, my mother married a new man who became my stepfather. We'll call him Bob. So I grew up with Bob being a great stepdad to me, but it always hurt that I never saw my dad Roger. And as I got older I got angrier and angrier that I never got to see my dad Roger because, hey, what kid who loves their dad wouldn't be? So one day, just after I hit puberty around 12, Bob and I got into a fight and he was telling me off and I pulled the "you're not my real dad" line. Cue my mother and Bob sitting me down and telling me that Bob is my biological father and that Roger is not my father, only a man I was led to believe was my biological father in order to keep up appearances to the outside world. That's almost the opposite of every other story. Usually people find out their dad is actually their stepdad, not the other way around. My dad is a real life superhero. He has graphics anesthesia. He sees numbers as colors and shapes because those sections of his brain are connected in ways normal people aren't. And he used that to catch a man who was skimming accounts when he worked at a bank. If anyone's interested, I'll write out the full story. Alright, here it is. My dad worked at a bank and for fun he'd scroll down through the account balances and watch the patterns of color. He did this just about every day, and over time he noticed more and more zeros. They stood out because they're empty space to him and it looks ugly. He was noticing this in a couple thousand accounts too. Just a few black spaces at the end of strings of color. He took it to the police because his boss wasn't listening to him. Turns out his boss was the guy skimming the accounts, but the police never took the investigation seriously until my dad compiled the evidence on his own and took it to them. My dad's a cool guy. This is one of the coolest stories I've ever read. While at a party about 5 years ago I met a girl who I really clicked with. Friends wise, I'm a girl. I started talking about my boyfriend, but not by that title, by name. She proceeded to tell me she knew him and had actually recently been on a date with him and how it was the most romantic date she'd ever been on. My boyfriend of a year. Crap just got real. Yes, we broke up shortly afterwards. That girl ended up being one of my best friends. We are friends to this day. Traded a crappy boyfriend for a best friend. Sounds like you came out ahead in the long run. That really sucks though. I am so going to do that. Pick a random grandchild, and before I die whisper to them I hope you get revenge for your real parents one day. Pick a random grandchild. Pick the worst little crap of them all. I was woken up early in the morning and told I was going to a therapeutic boarding school in Utah. I left that day, and I didn't visit home for over a year, and I didn't leave Utah for good until 22 months after I had arrived. The day we found out that the doctors were going to stop being aggressive with my father's treatment was very difficult. My grandparents flew back from Florida to get his affairs in order. Apparently my dad, a near-broke alcoholic, had not paid any of his life insurance premiums. My grandparents found out and paid all the late bills which allowed my siblings to collect on the multi-million-dollar policy. To this day I am grateful because I didn't find out until a few days after about the whole situation. Now I have enough money to pay for college and buy my first home. TLDR. My dad was broke when he died. Found out he had nearly $3 million in life insurance so that my siblings and I could go to school and start our lives. One of my cousins does not have the same father as her sisters. Their father found a handwritten note in which their mother wrote about her affair, the pregnancy, and then confronted her about it. They ended up staying married, and are currently married to this day. My mother and father found out, and told me a few years ago. It was more a slip up that I continually pursued until I got the answers. There are only 5 of us in the entire family that know. Me, my mother, my father, and the cousin's parents. The girl and her sisters have no idea. My brother, my sister, and I all have different dads. There was no cheating involved though, they were all in separate marriages. Mine was finding out the woman I called mum for the first 16 years of my life was actually my gran, and that my older sister was my birth mum. Apparently she got pregnant when she was 13, so her mum decided to raise me. Now I've got no idea what to call either of them. Calling my big sister mum just feels weird. She may be your biological mother, but that doesn't mean you have to call her mum. Your grandmother has earned that, I think. I found out while my uncle was on his deathbed he had a secret family with adult children. Mind you, this is the classist drunk uncle who lived alone or just had a live-in girlfriend wife from time to time but came to every family function. Nobody knew. Not his sisters, not even his mother. We still dispute this family because when we did ask my uncle he just said, "Hey, it's not a big deal. WTF." From a few things my grandfather said before he died, it appears that my great-grandmother, his mother, was an abortionist. My mum remembers her as a very conservative Catholic. That's pretty hardcore. I wonder how much medicinal practice was actually used in abortions during that time. Seems like there weren't many safe options at the time. This isn't really about me, but rather a friend of mine. I think to this day he still doesn't know this. My mother is good friends with his mother, which is how we met, and one day his mother tells my mother that the man we have all believed to be his father isn't really his father, and even he, the supposed father, doesn't even know it, because she was officially dating him back then but was cheating on him with the real father of the child. Said real father ended up dying before the child was ever born, I think in a car accident, and so she raised the child as the son of the man who she would go on to marry, and later divorce. TLDR. My friend's real dad is dead and he, nor his fake dad, know the truth. Earlier this last year I was hit up by a guy on Facebook claiming to be my half-brother. Fast forward a bit, and it turns out to be true. I don't know the details of the hows and whys, as every story has multiple sides, but my twin brother and I have been raised our whole lives, 23 years, by a wonderful man whom is the biological father of our older brother. There was never any hint or doubt that our dad wasn't our biological father, and we were raised with the utmost love and care by him, even though he and my mother were divorced or separated throughout the entirety of our lives. My father even had a fiancée leave him at one point because she was, apparently, unhappy that he was paying family support for kids that weren't technically of his biology. He really sacrificed a lot for us. And I couldn't have had a better dad. Hasn't really changed much in my life, honestly, and I never had any real crisis of conscience or identity about it, because hey, that sounds about right given my family history. Nonetheless, I'd say that counts as a nice little twist. Hey, your dad is a good man. When my grandfather was on his deathbed, he was very much aware of what he was saying, doing. He talked to each of the family members that were there privately. When I went in to see him, we talked for what seemed to be hours, joking as if it was another one of our every second weekend camping trips. It was very strange to know he would just be a lifeless shell of what he used to be. He put his hand on the back of my neck and told me I was about to go through the toughest 4 years of my life and to not act on my depressive actions. I left the room confused and broken. He passed within half an hour. The next 4 years and counting have been heck. My immediate family found out my father had been cheating on my mother and just fricked with our emotions and thoughts over the course of a year and a bit. I failed to get my high school diploma, so I started to work full time to pay for our home. Not as big of a plot twist as some of you guys, but he kept me from killing not only myself, but my father too. Your grandfather sounds like a better role model than his son. I lived with my father from 416, the entire time trying to convince him to let me move in with my mom who was 800 miles away. He never let me. I later found out this was because my mother's boyfriend was black and he disapproved of the relationship. I don't know your situation, but I feel horrible for your dad. I can't imagine how I would feel if my kid was begging me to let him move 800 miles away from me. I would feel like I failed as a parent. Lots of downer stories in this thread. Here's a slightly more fun plot twist. I've always loved choreography. I was never much of a dancer myself, but I loved ballet and musical theater growing up. It branched into other avenues too, like martial arts and animation. which led to me becoming a comic artist. I never had anyone in my family to really relate these passions to, until, on his deathbed, my grandfather started telling me stories I never heard before about being both a boxer and a dancer. May not sound like a big plot twist, but believe me when I say it felt like it at the time. We became really good friends all of a sudden, in his very last days on Earth. I was so glad to make that connection with him before he left. I just found out last week that all my life, my mother has been addicted to speed and has been hiding her addiction from my sister and I as best she could. On top of that, every single night, she takes sleeping pills. I also learned that her family is convincing her to lie to my father and continue her addiction, instead of getting help, purely to spite my father. I'd always suspected my mother had a drug problem, but never brought it up. My younger sister is still in the dark, and I intend to keep it that way. For now I'm just watching my mother slowly kill herself. Oh man, please don't just let that happen. You need to help your mom realize she has a problem and should get her started to recover. It's not worth it to just watch your mom get worse. No good can come of it. It would be great if your sister never finds out, but she's more likely to find out anyway. Not me, but a friend of mine in high school. So my friend was adopted when she was pretty young. Doesn't know any of her biological family. Friend is a typical high school girl, likes to go to the mall and whatnot. Every time she's there she gets guys hitting on her saying they know her from somewhere or something like that. She doesn't think much of it. She's a cute girl, so it happens often enough everywhere. As time passes she notices a bunch more people saying they know her at the mall and some call her by a different name. She eventually gets talking to one person and they swear they know someone who looks exactly like her. She ends up meeting this person and she really does look just like her. Turns out she had a twin that was also adopted and they were separated at birth. My brother called me while I was in college and proceeded to inform me that our mother had been married prior to marrying our father. My response was, I probably should have told you I was tripping on acid at the beginning of this call. College. When the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. I had always been told both of my grandfathers had died before I was born and I never felt there was any reason to question it. Fast forward 20 years and suddenly a man who looks identical to my dad shows up. It's my granddad. Turned out he had an affair with my nan when they were both married to other people and she became pregnant with my dad. My parents separated a while ago and I never had actually seen their wedding photos. I finally found one and saw my mom in her wedding dress, but she was holding my older sister, who looked about 3, making me about 1, or at least born for that matter. I thought there was a family secret until my mom told me she married my dad before a judge, and this picture was from the actual ceremony which took place years later. I'm sure that was a relief, finding out there wasn't actually anything weird going on. My parents also got married by a judge, just signing some paperwork, so I've never seen pictures of a wedding. Actually, now that I think about it, I've only seen one picture of them together that I know of. My wife has a large family, lots of aunts, uncles, great aunts, great uncles, etc. Family reunion attendance numbers in the hundreds. So, there was one of my wife's great aunts, Aunt Veda, born Sierra Nevada. She wasn't well known to the family, but a few decades after she died, my wife's cousin is doing some family history, and the story comes out. Turns out, Veda was, in her early life, a mortician's assistant. Then, she was hired by the state, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as a hangman's assistant, and then she got promoted. Apparently, she didn't do a lot of work. Hanging, as a form of capital punishment, was being phased out by the early 1900s. She still had her title and salary, though, after she died in Minneapolis. She was buried there. Eventually, the family wanted her grave moved down to the family gravesite in Iowa. When they unearthed the coffin, the lid fell open, and they discovered possibly the most disturbing thing about Aunt Veda's life: scratch marks on the inside of the lid. After reading this in my cousin's notes, my wife turned 3 shades of pale, calmed down a bit, and then said, "Welp, calm as a bee, eh?" I found out just recently over the last few years that my dad's gay and my mother is a W. Oh, and my uncle is adopted. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.